It's important to have an agenda because it promotes collaboration through deciding what the priorities are for sessions through a structured approach. So this helps for there to be a focus throughout while also supporting the client and to being an engaged and active participant. This should happen in the first or the second session. It's important to include the client and consistently check in to see if they'd like to add anything for this time and also for the upcoming sessions. So, items that are included within an agenda are firstly, review what's happened within the past week. So, this can be include brief topics. It's also important to check in and clarify at the end of rephrasing. Number two, reviewing what's happened in the last session. This can stem from problems that were discussed or going over insights that were gained between then and now. Number three, assessing the current mood. This can be rating the mood that the client has and seeing how they're feeling since the past week. A scale rating can also be used, for example, from 0 to 10, and then issuing a number each value. For example, 0 being the lowest and 10 being perfectly fine. Number four, reviewing the previous homework. This can go over topics that we're focused on, but also require additional elaboration. Number five, the main focus that will be discussed within the session. So this could go over different symptoms or issues that the client's facing, which could be tied to certain goals or the focus on CBT techniques. Number six, homework and assignment. This stems from topics that were discussed to support with additional exploration. And lastly, seven is feedback. So this goes into how the client's been experiencing the session, on how things have gone, leaving room for not only them to state their feelings surrounding it, but also expanding on comments on the day, whether helpful things or unhelpful. So critiquing each counselor's agenda setting, including what was present and what was missing. So for Grand, firstly, reviewing what's happened within the past week. So, reviewing what's happened within the past week, the client stated it was overwhelming regarding school issues with the boyfriend, and then followed up to say a few things. But then the therapist said, kind of worded that back to them, and then said, okay, there are a few things going on, but overall, you're okay. Making that a question, leaving that open-ended, using those open-ended questions allowed for the client to clarify. It showed the therapist went over what she had said, but then also checked in. Asking about the past week showed genuine interest, and then clarifying showed that the therapist was interested in understanding the entire picture rather than just leaving it at that. Second would be reviewing what's happened in the last session. The therapist said that they remembered that the client had difficulties during work, showed that he was invested, showed that he cared, and that he was paying attention, showing that he was actively listening. Then followed up asking about the issue and was checking in to see if there were changes or improvements. When therapist did this, the client seemed to be receptive and continued sharing. This could be because the client felt heard and felt as though the therapist was listening and not just following an agenda. Thirdly, assessing the current mood. The therapist reviewed how she had been feeling, how the client had been feeling the last few days. The client said that they'd feel overwhelmed with school and work and asked how she was feeling, but also dove into the reasoning behind it. The therapist didn't use a formal scale, but still checked in on the mood. Four, reviewing the previous homework. So, stated that seems to be okay since going over the homework, identified when she was feeling that way, and stated that the homework had helped her meet the supervisor in the middle. The client said, I'd identified what the homework was about, and then the client elaborated what was helpful. Saw that it worked, and then asked what was helpful. So this way, the therapist allowed the client to share her thoughts and feelings, showed that the therapist was listening. Even though it was more in passing, it was still included. Number five is the main topics discussed within the session. So, tied within previous homework, filling out the thought record and the homework. So, it kind of brought back to what's happened in the past sessions. Said that it was helpful for her day to day and to bring herself down. The therapist asked what the client wanted to go over. That was giving the client the autonomy over her own life, but over the session. Said there were a few things, and the therapist gave the client time to express what she would like to go over. So made it a collaborative process. The therapist wanted the input from the client. This also empowers the clients. After the client explained what was going on at school, work, and in relationship, The therapist then talked about prioritizing concerns. Um, while the client said that it was difficult for her to narrow it down, the therapist then asked open-ended questions, asked about the thought process, allowing the client to critically think and problem solve, but also wanted to hear what she was thinking about. That made it collaborative, trying to narrow it down. So the therapist asked like what areas um, are affecting the functioning and survival, which gets in the way of the mood and surviving, right? And when she said schoolwork, he asked for her to elaborate. That way, she would be able to problem solve and think and make sure that what she was choosing is something she would want to prioritize. The therapist wasn't speaking too much, allowing the client to kind of take focus and control over the conversation, allowing her to really go through everything while the therapist was just there to kind of guide. Then the therapist said that they could use this as the priority and they'd also look to something else if there was time. This focus on collaboration, the therapist was leading with warmth, with genuineness, allowing the client to take control of her life, take control of the conversation, of the session, and focus on what she wanted to. Number 6 was homework and assignment. Will assigned homework like he did last time and stated that based on the challenges that she had mentioned. Made sure she was okay with it, expressed what she thought would be helpful, made sure it was okay to go through something the same way as previously, supported with her autonomy. And then 7 is feedback. Asked about how she's feeling about the agenda. And then the homework, but didn't go too much into depth about this, didn't ask about additional comments, what was helpful or even could be improved. So Grande went about this session in a more natural way, creating collaboration and structure, but still making it conversational while it still had certain direction. The collaboration aspect allowed the client to feel empowered to decide on what was being discussed. This focused on supporting active participation, was encouraged. Using the agenda setting as kind of a tool, but not something that needed to be the only priority, allowing there to be like focus and respect to the client's autonomy. It didn't go through goals in depth, therefore, it didn't focus exactly on what she'd like to achieve by the end of the session, and didn't focus clearly on past sessions and treatment that might be ongoing. It could have been a bit more specific and had a summary and then a check-in that would have made sure that the client had achieved or will achieve what she had wanted. There was rapport building, which was of great strengths, which would also help with planning, but didn't have those goals that could be measured or specifically focused on. But the structure could have been improved just a little bit more. For Qualia, the first one is reviewing what happened within the past week. So it asked about how the week was. This client said, oh, the week was okay and was feeling a bit of hope. That was a key word that the client had mentioned. So the therapist kind of went from that as well, mentioned that that was a good word to use, discussed any important things that had come up, allowed for the client to openly share and explore the meaning of what they had said instead of just kind of brushing over it because it was at the beginning. This showed the client that at that point, the therapist was wanting to understand the meaning and uncover the meaning and the feelings and the thoughts surrounding that word. Second would be reviewing what's happened in the last session. Explained bridging. The therapist explained bridging from past session to this session, and then also went through the agenda, explained the reasoning behind it, why that was going to take place, talked about what they had figured out the last session, and asked what resonated from the last session. Then listened to his responses, summarized what happened in the last session, and made sure they were on the same page. That clarifying showed that the therapist really cared about what the client had understood and taken away from this. Third would be assessing the current mood. The therapist had asked from a scale of 1 to 10 and asked what the mood was. When the client said it was a 6 today, but then the therapist asked about the week. And when the client said 5, they chose to go with that average. He also asked if it was better or worse since the last time. And when the client said slightly better, he asked a follow-up question. What was going on through all those low points that the client had mentioned? He told them that they could focus on what the client wanted to talk about, but the therapist also asked if it was okay if he had added something that he was thinking, which was behavioral activation, but also made sure that was okay with the client, made sure that it was still the client's will. Then asked the client about prioritizing, and they worked through that. 4 was reviewing the previous homework. Went over factors talked about previously, which was the 5-factor model, and asked what was learned from that. Then they discussed the homework and heard that the client was enjoying having homework and went on to express they would do that again. Went over briefly what that looked like and supported the autonomy. Since that's something the client had brought up, the therapist spoke about that right away. Number 5 was main topics that would be discussed within the session. So the therapist asked what they would like to talk about from the past week. The client said they wanted to understand the low points and because they couldn't understand the thoughts. They asked about problems that might be important to talk about. The client mentioned again those low points would be those problems. That focused on collaboration and prioritizing together as they both added something to the agenda. Homework and assignment talked about how he thought the homework would be about doing things and scheduling. It wasn't assigned specifically in the agenda portion. And then for 7th, which is feedback, asked about feedback from the last session to see if he was hesitant to say anything, shared about feedback, and stated they are a team. That would potentially allow the client to know that the therapist sees them as a team, that it is a collaborative process, and didn't want the client to feel as though they didn't have a say. However, the therapist didn't ask about feedback specifically about this session. Qualia explained the reason for having an agenda, encouraged participation and problem solving. There was collaboration, however, the therapist did lead the majority of the conversation. The therapist made sure to check for understanding, but didn't go specifically through past homework thoroughly and seemed the agenda may have been something just to mark off like a checklist, which might have made the client feel as though potentially it was rushed. Therapist could have built more rapport, therefore trust would have been more built, and the client could have felt more comfortable in the environment to direct more conversation. So describe the differences between the two approaches to agenda setting. So with Grand was sitting across from the client, conveyed warmth, genuineness, even the way Grand was kind of leaning in, open communication, open body language, open posture, but seemed that made the client and the therapist seem as though they were equals. The way he was sitting, the way his tone was, the eye contact. The Grand spoke less, gave prompts, but listened more. The client seemed to have been guiding that conversation. Seemed as though it was a bit more of a conversation. It flowed more naturally. There wasn't a rigid structure. And even asked about the mood as part of a conversation, a little more casually. While Qualia stood up while the client sat down, showed a power imbalance, seemed more teacher and student rather than equals. Qualia, that therapist seemed to have talked more. It was a bit more question and answer rather than guided conversation that flowed naturally and smoothly, seemed to have a more rigid structure. There was a greater emphasis placed on the mood currently in an average numerical way, while the therapist seemed to have been guiding the conversation and was writing out boards, writing up notes on the board, having that visual component. So discussion as to which is preferred and why. Grand was preferred, as this approach is guided by the client, but still focuses on collaboration and autonomy, whereas Qualia was guided more by the therapist. And while there was still collaboration and some parts of autonomy, that didn't seem to be the focus. Grand allowed the client to not only share their thoughts, but had a conversation flow from a place that makes sense to them. And the client's autonomy was respected and encouraged, and they could make their own decision, which supports active participation. The client was empowered to uncover their strengths and learn problem-solving skills, in turn growing their own self-confidence, where they could be more independent. They were guiding that conversation, and sitting kind of as equal, so they would have been empowered. Whereas Qualia, that power imbalance, even the way the client was kind of looking up at the therapist, made it seem as though the client was a little hesitant. Having a flexible approach allowed the client to guide the conversation. Therefore, it was more meaningful for them to share kind of whatever they would like. Whereas in Qualia's, it was a little more rigid. In Grand, the focus was building rapport at the beginning to ensure that safe space, positive therapeutic relationship where they could be understood and stem from trust. Whereas in Qualia's, there wasn't a lot of rapport building. It kind of went directly into the session, didn't ensure there was that safety and comfort. The client seems to be seen as a whole person and respected and validated through their lived experiences, in Grun's. So the therapist can guide conversation. However, doesn't need to take control. Therefore, it's still a collaborative effort, which was seen in Grand and not as much in Colliers. There is a much needed balance where there's flexibility yet still structure with both which both supports growth, meaningful connection, and reaching their goals. Discuss which style resonates, which style, sorry, aligns most with my personality and approach to counseling. So Grand's approach aligns more with my personality and approach to counseling. I believe it's important for the client to guide the conversation, express what's most important, but if they're struggling to prioritize, have the therapist support in that decision, but not make that decision. Having that more flexible style rather than a rigid structure and feeling as though the therapist is controlling that conversation. Having that collaborative approach and the therapist working with the client, having that positive therapeutic relationship through active listening, supporting by listening and wanting to fully understand the client with genuineness, empathy, and respect. Working on problem solving together. This supports in building a positive therapeutic relationship, which is where trust stems from. That trust, safety, comfort. Autonomy. So the client is the expert of their own lives, and having that collaboration allows for the client to share and go through what's most important to them. That importance of rapport building rather than just jumping right into the issue, having time to build trust, comfort. I would want to build an environment that supports this. Feeling empowered, clients can grow and work through certain aspects of their lives when they can make their own decisions and are provided with tools. Guiding that conversation is a great first step. While being treated as someone who's valued, capable, it gives meaning to the client's lives and makes them as though they can feel as though they can regain control. I value collaboration as it's important to have clients bring their lived experiences, and I would reflect on this. Clients are the experts of their own lives, and making them and supporting them with making sense of their experiences allows them to regain control and feel empowered. Active listening is so vital as there can be trust and rapport building. Flexibility allows for clients to have space to show up as they are and know that they'll always be met with empathy, genuineness, and respect. Describe three common difficulties in agenda setting relating to my style, practice, and personality, and then also discussing strategies that someone can avoid or help get out of difficulties when they arise. So the first would be setting a vague agenda. So this might be a bit more difficult if it's client-led, therefore leaving a little bit too much of flexibility at times. The client could be having space to share more flexibly, but that might result in not having as clear of a direction for the agenda setting. By not having that set agenda with more structure, it could transfer to homework and practical skills being a little more difficult to achieve. In order to ensure that challenges for the agenda setting don't happen or are minimized, it's important to still promote collaboration, but also ensure clients have a specific priority in mind. Therefore, goals are able to be achieved and laid out. Ensuring that there's structure while remaining flexible isn't something that needs to be checked off like a checklist. However, there's still clear direction. Summarizing what the priorities are and going over goals for the session through collaboration and ensuring clients' autonomy is supported. Number two, tackling issues that aren't on the agenda without discussing them first. Since I want to consistently be attentive to what the client's feeling and sharing about, if something new comes up, it might steer the conversation in that direction. This might push the conversation, therefore, certain items that were on the agenda might get missed. Goals, therefore, might not be able to be achieved, and the focus might constantly shift. It's important to acknowledge concerns, however, perhaps collaboratively seeing if there's something that aligns with the agenda or a priority if it should be saved for later on in the conversation or in a different session. Checking in with the client on the priority and how it aligns with their goals to see if it should be moved to another time or if it's an extension of something that's already been discussed. Number three is skipping from one topic to another without achieving closure on any of them. Since it's being client-led, and that's a focus for me, it might be difficult for client to not move to other topics, but I support that, but making sure that it's not leaving it with not tying loose ends up, right? So making sure that even if the client is leading it, and might move from one topic to another, making sure to tie the loose ends without going to a new topic. Clients could bring up different concerns, and I would want them to feel heard. However, moving to different topics might have the clients feeling as though things might not be resolved. So summarizing would be important and figuring out a priority list so clients can still lead and feel heard and be supported, yet also feel as though they're accomplishing something. Being able to ensure that there's a priority list and narrowing it down to what can be discussed then. Therefore, the client can have the expectations on what can be covered in the session and reminded that if there's more time, then more can be covered. Also, reflecting on what's said through open-ended questions and through different types of questions to see if there's more to be discussed. While it's important to lead with empathy and supporting the client's autonomy, it's also important to have it still be client-led. However, structure is still important. Therefore, goals can be met and it's collaborative. This way, agenda setting can allow clients to feel empowered, but also remain focused, especially since CBT is a quite a short approach to therapy.